The sky over northern Germany was a canvas of chaos, streaked with the silver flashes of tracer rounds and the roaring symphony of engines at full throttle. A formation of American B-17 flying fortresses climbed relentlessly through the icy stratosphere, their steel frames shimmering against the pale morning sun. Below them, the black forest stretched like a dark sea, hiding the eyes of waiting Luftwaffe pilots. The German airmen laughed at what they believed was a predictable, lumbering target, unescorted American bombers, heavy and slow, like sitting ducks. Captain Heinrich Vogel, a veteran ace with over 40 confirmed kills, leaned over his Messerschmitt Bf 109, scanning the sky with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. "These Americans," he muttered to his wingman, "they fly without their sharks, without their fangs. Today, the hunt will be easy." But the air held a secret, one that would soon turn arrogance into shock. High above the front lines, a new breed of fighter was on the move. A sleek, silver Mustang, its engine singing a song of speed and deadly precision. These were no ordinary escorts. They were P-51 Mustangs, and they carried with them the promise of a revolution in aerial warfare. For months, Allied bomber crews had faced devastating losses. Without fighter cover, their missions over Europe were a gauntlet of flak, bullets, and German fighters eager to prove their superiority. The skies were their battlefield, and every sortie felt like rolling dice against death. Yet rumors had begun to spread among the American squadrons. An audacious idea, a tactical maneuver so daring that at first it seemed reckless. Pilots whispered about flying upside down, diving headlong under enemy guns, and then rising into the sun to strike with unthinkable speed. The question lingered like smoke across the clouds. Could a single tactic, a single act of ingenuity, rewrite the rules of air combat? Could the Americans, once vulnerable and ridiculed, now turn the hunter into the hunted? In the cold metal cockpit of a B-17, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" O'Connor gripped the yoke, feeling every shudder of the engines, every tremor, as bullets splintered the wings. Around him, his crew moved with practiced urgency, dropping bombs on the industrial heart of Germany. Yet, in the back of his mind, a thought lingered, almost absurd in its simplicity. What if the skies no longer belonged to the Germans? What if courage, cunning, and a touch of madness could change the course of history? Below, the enemy pilots were confident. Above, the bombers climbed, seemingly defenseless. And in the distance, a silver flash, cutting through clouds like a blade, announced that the age of unchallenged aerial domination was coming to an end. This is the story of how American bombers, once laughed at and feared, were transformed into unstoppable forces, not by sheer numbers, but by innovation, daring, and the Mustang pilots who would escort them to Berlin. It is a tale of risk and ingenuity, of a war fought not only in steel and fire, but in the minds and hearts of those brave enough to defy convention. The question remained: why did the Americans start flying in ways that seemed insane at first? And how did that choice shift the balance of the air war over Europe forever? By 1943, the skies over Europe had become a proving ground for both technological ingenuity and human courage. The Allied forces were locked in a desperate struggle to cripple the German war machine, and the backbone of this effort was the strategic bombing campaign. The B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed the Flying Fortress for a reason, carried crews of 10 men into the heart of enemy territory. Their mission simple, yet perilous: destroy factories, rail lines, and aircraft plants that fueled the Nazi war effort. But these missions were anything but simple. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies with a lethal combination of experience and aircraft designed for dogfights. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s could outmaneuver the lumbering B-17s with terrifying ease. German pilots, trained rigorously in the art of aerial combat, had developed tactics that preyed on the bomber's vulnerabilities: attack from above, dive in coordinated swarms, and break apart formations to pick off isolated targets. Every mission became a harrowing trial of nerves and skill. American bomber crews tried to adapt. They flew in tight formations, relying on overlapping fields of defensive fire from 50 caliber machine guns mounted in every conceivable direction. Yet the results were grim. For every target hit, several bombers were lost. By late 1943, the statistics were sobering. During raids over Berlin, Frankfurt, and the Ruhr, losses sometimes exceeded 20% of the squadron. For the men aboard, it was a calculus of survival, one that left them exhausted and haunted. The introduction of long-range fighters changed the equation, or at least it was supposed to. Initially, the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt provided some cover, but their range was limited. Escorting the bombers all the way to the heart of Germany remained impossible. American pilots often had to turn back while the bombers pressed onward, leaving them exposed to relentless German attacks. The irony was brutal. The skies over Europe seemed dominated by the enemy, yet Americans held a technological ace waiting to be played: the P-51 Mustang. Meanwhile, German pilots were confident. Veteran aces like Oberleutnant Adolf Galland and Hauptmann Werner Mülders had learned to read the patterns of Allied bombing raids like a chess game in the clouds. They mocked unescorted bombers, calling them flying cows and taking pride in the carnage inflicted with minimum risk. In dogfights over the Reich, speed and maneuverability were their allies, and discipline in formation attacks turned these skirmishes into deadly routines. The Allies, however, were not without brilliant minds. Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr., one of the first African-American pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces, had noted the inefficiencies in the standard tactics. Engineers at North American Aviation studied the Mustang's Merlin engine, tweaking it for high-altitude performance. Innovators like General Ira Eaker and General Curtis LeMay began to envision a new doctrine: never let the bombers fly alone again. Escort them. Protect them. Give them a fighter so fast, so agile, and so enduring that the Luftwaffe would no longer have the advantage. The situation on the front lines demanded ingenuity. Pilots had grown tired of predictable losses. Flight leaders debated endlessly over briefing tables, tracing enemy formations on maps, calculating angles of attack, altitude advantages, and the lethal arcs of flak batteries. Every miscalculation could mean death for dozens of men. Yet the pressure forced creative thinking. It was here, amid the tactical stalemates and bitter defeats, that the seeds of a revolutionary strategy were planted. This was the world into which the P-51 Mustang would fly, a sleek silver harbinger of change. With its unprecedented range, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, reach Berlin, and challenge the arrogance of the Luftwaffe at its very core. Yet for all its potential, the idea was still untested. Pilots, commanders, and engineers faced a daunting question. Could a single new approach overcome years of German air superiority and change the calculus of the air war forever? In the quiet moments before missions, bomber crews would glance at the horizon, wondering if this time would be different. The skies were dangerous, unforgiving, and unpredictable. But amid the clouds, a whisper of hope emerged, the promise of escorts that would turn fear into confidence, vulnerability into strength, and eventually, laughter into shock. And so the stage was set. Unescorted bombers, feared yet ridiculed. Luftwaffe aces, confident and lethal. And a daring, innovative plan that would soon rewrite the rules of air combat. The question now was not whether the bombers would reach their targets, but whether anyone would survive the skies to tell the tale. The early months of 1944 brought no relief for the men of the 8th Air Force. Day after day, B-17 formations carved through icy skies over Germany, only to be met with relentless flak and swarms of agile Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Each mission was a gauntlet, each sortie a lottery, in which luck often dictated life or death. Lieutenant Robert Bobby Hayes of the 91st Bomb Group remembered one raid over Schweinfurt, a city vital to Germany's ball-bearing industry. "We had no escort that day," he recalled later. "The Germans were waiting. They tore us apart like we were paper." Of the 60 bombers that took off, nearly 20 never returned. For the men on board, there was no glory, only the bitter realization that bravery alone could not guarantee survival. These losses were not anomalies. They were the rule. Missions over Regensburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr faced identical fates. Bombers flew in tight boxes, gunners firing into the clouds with a desperate rhythm. But the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots exploited every weakness. Single-engine fighters darted in from above, dove on isolated planes, and vanished into the sun. By mid-1944, bomber crews had learned a grim lesson. Without fighter cover, they were sitting targets, no matter their skill or numbers. The human cost was staggering. Pilots, bombardiers, and navigators endured months of fear, sleep-deprived and tense, haunted by the cries of wounded comrades. Captain Paul W. Tibbets, of the 305th Bomb Group, noted that morale was fraying. "We were beginning to feel that the sky itself was against us," he said. "Every mission could be the last, and nothing we tried seemed to make a difference." Commanders struggled as well. General Eaker and General LeMay debated endlessly over strategy, trying to balance aggressive bombing campaigns with the harsh reality of mounting losses. Standard tactics, tight formations, mutual defensive fire, and careful altitude planning were proving insufficient. The Luftwaffe had adapted, and even minor mistakes could cascade into catastrophe. One particularly harrowing example came during a raid on Hamburg. American bombers, flying in predicted patterns, were met by a coordinated German assault. Dozens of bombers were lost in minutes, engines ablaze, wings torn, crews plummeting to the earth below. The psychological toll was severe. Gunners began hesitating, pilots second-guessing every maneuver, and mission leaders felt the weight of responsibility crush them. The air war was reaching a point of stalemate, one where courage alone could not break through. In the briefing rooms, discussions became desperate. Pilots argued for daring maneuvers, for attacks at unusual angles, for anything that might tip the balance in their favor. Engineers analyzed data from every sortie, searching for patterns, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. It became clear: traditional methods were dead. Without innovation, the air war would continue to bleed American forces in horrific numbers. Yet even in the darkest moments, a spark of hope flickered. Rumors of the Mustang's capabilities spread among crews. Its speed, Agility and range promised a chance to escort bombers deep into Germany, providing protection that had been previously impossible. But there were skeptics. Some considered the idea naive, even reckless. Could a handful of fast fighters truly neutralize the Luftwaffe's superiority? Could they survive against waves of German aces, still confident and lethal? Amid this uncertainty, a few pilots began experimenting with unconventional maneuvers, flying upside down, executing sharp dives, or breaking formation in calculated bursts, became a subject of whispered debates and secret tests. It was dangerous, bordering on madness, yet necessity demanded innovation. The very lives of crews depended on someone thinking differently, daring to defy convention, and trusting skill over routine. The crisis was clear. Unescorted bombers were sitting targets, standard tactics had failed, and the Luftwaffe's confidence threatened to tip the air war in their favor permanently. The American airmen faced a stark choice: accept continuing losses or attempt something bold, something no one had tried before. It was here, at the edge of despair, that the seeds of a radical change took root. The question now was not whether a new approach was possible, but whether anyone had the courage, ingenuity, and sheer audacity to implement it. Somewhere above the clouds, amid fear and uncertainty, the first whispers of the Mustang escort strategy were taking shape. And soon, those whispers would become the thunder of revolution in the skies over Europe. It was a crisp morning in early 1944 when the first whispers of a radical idea became action. In the briefing room of the 4th Fighter Group at Debden Airfield, Colonel Donald Blakesley studied maps, charts, and weather reports. The problem was clear. The B-17s, despite their defensive firepower, could not survive unescorted against the deadly Luftwaffe formations. Every loss of men and aircraft was a bitter blow, and the traditional approach, tight formations and hope, was no longer enough. Across the Atlantic, engineers at North American Aviation had been perfecting the P-51 Mustang, integrating the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to give it unprecedented high-altitude performance. With its speed, agility, and endurance, the Mustang could now accompany bombers all the way to Berlin. But technology alone was insufficient. To truly tilt the balance, pilots had to rethink aerial combat itself. It was Captain Chuck Yeager, then a young but fearless fighter pilot, who first proposed a daring maneuver during a training exercise. What if we approach the enemy from angles they don't expect? Fly inverted briefly, dive through their lines, and strike before they can react? At first, the idea seemed preposterous. Flying upside down in combat, dodging flak and enemy fire, was considered borderline suicidal. Yet desperation bred innovation, and the logic was undeniable. Unpredictability could become a weapon. Tests began over the English countryside. Mustang pilots experimented with high-speed dives, inverted passes, and treetop low maneuvers to simulate surprise attacks. Each flight pushed the limits of both machine and man. Some ended in minor crashes, others in sheer exhilaration, but every sortie provided vital data. Pilots began to understand the subtle balance between risk and reward, discovering that audacity combined with precision could yield astonishing results. The first operational deployment was cautious, but historic. A squadron of P-51s escorted a formation of B-17s on a bombing run to the industrial city of Brunswick. As the bombers penetrated deep into enemy territory, German fighters dove from the sun, expecting easy prey. Instead, They were met by a wall of silver Mustangs, appearing from impossible angles, moving faster and more decisively than anything they had anticipated. The Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to dominating the skies, were caught off guard. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" O'Connor, aboard his B-17, remembered the moment vividly. "We were in the middle of the formation when these Mustangs swooped in. I'd never seen anything like it. The Germans pulled back confused, and for the first time I felt we had a fighting chance." Commanders were initially skeptical. Could these unconventional tactics survive the chaos of real combat? Some worried about the risks of pilots attempting inverted dives under fire, the potential for collisions in tight formations, and the sheer audacity of defying conventional doctrine. Yet, the results spoke for themselves. Enemy aircraft were disrupted, bomber losses fell dramatically, and morale among American crews soared. News of the first successful sorties spread quickly. Reports described Luftwaffe pilots stunned and unable to react, calling the Mustang escorts a revelation. The strategy was simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Protect the bombers with an unpredictable high-speed shield that could strike before the enemy even realized what was happening. The breakthrough was more than just a maneuver. It was a mindset shift. The skies were no longer a domain where the German ace ruled by experience and tradition. With courage, innovation, and the P-51 Mustang, the Americans could now dictate the terms of engagement. From inverted passes to low-altitude feints, each tactic leveraged surprise, speed, and precision to turn the hunters into the hunted. This was the moment the balance of power began to shift. Where the Luftwaffe had once laughed at the flying cows, confusion and fear replaced arrogance. The American bomber crews, once sitting ducks, were now supported by guardians who could dance with danger, push the limits of physics, and strike with surgical precision. The skies over Europe were changing forever. And yet, every victory came with risk. Each maneuver demanded split-second timing, nerves of steel, and unwavering trust in the machine and in each other. The first real test was complete, but it was only the beginning. For the pilots of the 8th Air Force, this was not just innovation. It was survival, and the stakes could not be higher. The first full-scale missions with P-51 Mustang escorts marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. What had begun as an audacious experiment became a strategy that reshaped the skies and shattered the Luftwaffe's long-held dominance. Bomber formations, once exposed and vulnerable, now moved with newfound confidence, their silver shadows guarded by the sleek, roaring Mustangs. On a bright September morning in 1944, a squadron of Mustangs escorted a force of B-17s to Berlin for the first time. German pilots, expecting easy prey, were met with a wall of speed and surprise. Mustang pilots executed inverted dives, high-speed flanking maneuvers, and unexpected climbs, disrupting attacks before they could fully form. Over the course of the mission, more than a dozen Luftwaffe fighters were shot down, and bomber losses were cut by nearly half. Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Hayes later recalled, "For the first time, it felt like we had the advantage. The tables had turned, and the enemy didn't know what hit them." This success was not without cost. Some Mustangs were lost in audacious maneuvers, pilots pushed to the edge of endurance, and flak still remained a deadly presence. Lessons had to be learned the hard way. In one mission over Dresden, a miscalculated inverted pass led to a Mustang collision, claiming 2 pilots and highlighting the razor-thin margin between bravery and disaster. Every victory carried with it the memory of sacrifice, reinforcing the principle that innovation in war always comes with risk. The consequences of this new tactic reverberated immediately. German air strategy, once confident and methodical, was forced to adapt. Luftwaffe pilots began to fly more cautiously, hesitant to engage escorted bombers directly. The psychological impact was profound. Arrogance turned to uncertainty, and German commanders realized that their previous dominance could no longer be taken for granted. The once laughable flying cows now had teeth, and their predators, the Mustangs, were fast, precise, and unrelenting. American air strategy evolved in parallel. Pilots who had survived the early years of unescorted missions shared their experiences, training new crews in the art of coordination, anticipation, and daring. The philosophy behind the escort tactics became doctrine. Never leave bombers exposed, leverage speed and surprise, and trust in innovation. Engineers continued to refine the Mustangs, improving their range, armament, and high-altitude performance, ensuring that the strategy would remain effective through the end of the war. Individual stories illustrate the scale of this transformation. Captain Robert Johnson, who had survived multiple raids over Hamburg, led a formation that destroyed an entire wave of German fighters with no bomber losses. The exhilaration among crews was palpable. They were no longer passive participants in a deadly lottery. They were active, empowered, and lethal. News from Berlin described confusion and shock among Luftwaffe units, noting that American bombers, once mocked, now moved as part of an almost impenetrable shield. Yet the victories were not absolute. Even with Mustang escorts, flak batteries continued to claim aircraft, and mistakes in coordination could be fatal. The Luftwaffe began experimenting with new formations and tactics, attempting to counter the American innovation. The air war had become a chess game of strategy, ingenuity, and adaptation, with each side trying to anticipate and outmaneuver the other. Despite these challenges, the overarching result was clear. The introduction of long-range, agile escorts had shifted the balance of power in the skies over Europe. For the first time, American bombers could reach the heart of Germany with reduced losses. Morale soared, commanders gained confidence, and the psychological edge shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe's laughter at unescorted bombers was replaced with apprehension, and the war in the air began to tilt irrevocably toward the Allies. This was more than a tactical success. It was a paradigm shift. The bravery of the pilots, the audacity of the maneuvers, and the ingenuity of the engineers combined to create a new reality in the air. The skies were no longer dominated solely by the most experienced aces, but by those willing to innovate, take risks, and embrace a new form of aerial warfare. And through it all, the lesson endured. In war, as in life, survival and success often depend not just on strength or numbers, but on creativity, courage, and the willingness to challenge convention. The roar of the engines over Europe gradually faded as the war drew closer to its conclusion. The skies, once dominated by the agile, cunning Luftwaffe aces, had been irrevocably transformed. The audacious strategies of the American pilots, combined with the technological marvel of the P-51 Mustang, had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. What had begun as experimentation, often bordering on madness, became a decisive factor in the Allied victory. For the men who had flown those missions, the memory of risk and loss was indelible. Some returned home as heroes, their names etched into the annals of aviation history. Others never made it back, their courage recorded only in the solemn roll of the fallen. Captain Chuck Yeager would later become a legend, his daring maneuvers emblematic of the spirit that defined this era. Lieutenant James O'Connor, who had once gripped the yoke of a B-17 with fear and anticipation, lived to recount the story of how innovation and courage turned vulnerability into strength. But the legacy of those days extends beyond individual heroism. The inverted dives, high-speed flanking maneuvers, and daring escort missions demonstrated a universal truth. Innovation, even in the face of immense danger, can alter the course of history. In the skies over Germany, what had seemed impossible, protecting vulnerable bombers while striking fear into a dominant enemy, became reality. These tactics reshaped doctrine, influencing post-war fighter strategy, formation flying, and the philosophy of air combat for decades to come. The lessons were profound. Courage alone is not enough. Knowledge, creativity, and calculated risk are essential. The willingness to challenge conventional thinking, to try what others deem foolish, can turn the tide when the odds are stacked against you. And yet, every breakthrough carries a price. Pilots paid with their lives, and victories were always shadowed by loss. The story of the Mustang escorts is a story of triumph entwined with sacrifice. Even the enemy could not ignore the transformation. German aces, once smug and dismissive, were forced to adapt, rethink, and respect the unpredictability of their opponent. The laughter that greeted unescorted bombers had been silenced by the precision, daring, and audacity of a new kind of fighter. History would remember that the turning point was not just the machines or the numbers, but the human will to innovate and survive under unimaginable pressure. As the last of the B-17 formations touched down in England, escorted by the sleek Mustangs cutting through the clouds, one could almost hear the echo of a lesson that transcends war. Fortune favors not the reckless alone, nor the merely brave, but those who combine courage with ingenuity, who dare to see beyond the known and act upon it. The skies over Europe would never be the same. And while the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire have long since faded into history, the story of these pilots endures, a testament to human daring, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of survival against impossible odds. In the end, a simple, audacious idea, a maneuver at first deemed insane, an escort strategy once considered reckless, changed not only the course of a war, but the very way the world would think about courage, ingenuity, and the human spirit. The lesson resonates still. Sometimes the smallest act of daring can echo across history, transforming fear into power, vulnerability into victory, and the impossible into reality.